Hey guys, welcome back to Meghan Grace DIY. Today's tutorial is going to focus on a simple scrub cap. I want to start today's tutorial by pointing out that there's lots of different types of scrub caps, and there's also lots of different ways to make this type of scrub cap. So I might show you some techniques that work for you, but take what works and leave what doesn't. For this tutorial, you're going to need 2 pieces of fabric. The piece on the left is folded in half long ways and is about 11.5 inches folded, which would make it 23 inches unfolded. And then the piece is about 7 inches wide. The piece of fabric on the right is about 10 inches long by 11 inches wide. But keep in mind, I'm giving you a little bit of extra fabric to cut around your pattern pieces. The pattern pieces for the scrub cap are located in the description box below. Take the piece of fabric on the right and fold that in half as well. Take the pattern piece labeled Scrub Cap Crown and place it on the piece of fabric on the right. Make sure that the part of the pattern piece that says Cut Unfold is lined up with the fold of the fabric. And then go ahead and pin your pattern piece in place. I'm just going to go ahead and apologize if my pinning here looks really awkward. I'm still trying to figure out how to stand next to the tripod and work while the camera is in the right place. But just like everyone else, we learn new things every day. Now let's take the second pattern piece labeled Scrub Cap Sides and place that on our other piece of fabric. This is another cut unfold pattern piece, so make sure that the part of the pattern piece that says Cut Unfold is lined up with the fold of the fabric. So when I was choosing the type of pattern I wanted to use for this kind of scrub cap, I noticed quite a few of the patterns have sort of a tail that would extend off the top of the pattern piece that I have on the left. I opted to not use that tail for 2 reasons. One, I felt that using that tail as the tie would make the cap kind of bulky for the wearer. The second reason is I wanted to make the pattern as easy to print as possible, and taking that tail out would make the pattern piece fit into an 8.5 by 11 inch piece of paper. So once we get a bit further in the construction process, I'm going to point out where we could go a few different ways to create the ties in the back. I choose one specific way, but again, there's a couple different ways you could do it. Now that you're all pinned down, you're going to go ahead and cut out your pattern pieces. We're also going to need about 6 inches of 1/2 inch wide elastic and about 18 to 24 inches of a 2-inch wide strip of fabric to create your ties for the back. I'm going to finish off the edge of the scrub cap by just doing a small rolled hem, but if you wanted to, you could use a bias strip to finish off the edge of the scrub cap. As you take the pins out from the pattern pieces, it's important to put a pin in the center top of the crown. And we're also going to put a pin in the center front top of the scrub cap outside. We're all done with the pattern pieces, so you can go ahead and put those to the side. Now, when you go to unfold your pattern pieces, you're going to take those pins that you put in place and use them to line your pattern pieces up properly. I'm taking the pin that's in the center of the outside of the scrub cap and lining it up with the pin that's in the center of the crown of the scrub cap. And I'm going to go ahead and pin the pieces together. Next, we're going to go ahead and pin the edging of the top of the scrub cap to the edging of the side of the scrub cap. Before we get started on this step, I just want to point out that in terms of sewing, pinning and sewing curves can be a pretty difficult sewing technique. So please make sure you take your time and don't worry if you need to redo it a couple of times. It's always okay to get a little bit frustrated, and I always tell my students, you learn some of your best lessons from making mistakes. So I'm starting in the center front and I'm working towards the left. I'm taking the 2 edges of the fabric and I'm lining them up together, placing a pin about every, say, 1/2 inch to 3/4 of an inch. Just keep walking the edges of the fabric together, placing your pins. You'll start to notice that the outside of the scrub cap pattern piece will get a few wrinkles or bubbles in it, but as long as it's flat and even at the seams, you're doing it right. And I'm gonna just keep pinning here until we get all the way to the end of the scrub cap crown and the scrub cap outside piece. And then once we're done putting all of our pins in the left side, we're gonna go ahead and repeat and put all the pins into the right side. In my opinion, getting around the top part of the crown is the hardest part, so once you've got that pinned down, the rest should be easy peasy. Now that you've got both pieces all pinned together, this is what your scrub cap should look like. We're going to start sewing by placing one side of the back edge of the scrub cap underneath the presser foot. This pattern piece allows for 1/4 of an inch of a seam allowance, which basically means the fabric will be lined up on the right side of the presser foot. I'm using a straight stitch with a length of 3. So as we start to hit the curves, I want to bring up again that this can be a little bit on the challenging side. You may need to do something called easing, which is just gently stretching one side of the fabric to make the curves fit smoothly together. And if you feel like you might make like a little bubble or a pucker sewing over a pin, you can take the pins out as you sew and smooth things along the seam. So you can kind of see what I'm referring to right here. I'm about to hit a little bit of a bubble, so I'm gonna go ahead, I'm gonna take the pin out, I'm just gonna smooth that edge together to make sure it will sew together nice and flat. And I'm gonna finish sewing all the way down at the other end of the cap. Once that seam is sewn and it's nice and smooth, we're gonna go back with a zigzag stitch to finish off the edge so we don't have any fraying inside of the cap. My zigzag stitch is about 3 in width and 4 in length. Now it's time for the elastic. We're going to take the back end of the cap that's now pretty much a straight line after being sewn together. I'm going to do a technique where I sew in the elastic without creating a casing. If you've never sewn elastic in this way before, I created a separate tutorial that goes into a bit more detail into sewing the elastic in this way. I'm starting with the elastic about a 1/2 inch from the edge of the cap. Then I'm using my widest zigzag stitch to stitch the elastic down to the edge of the cap. You'll notice that I'm pulling the elastic as I sew, which stretches the elastic along the fabric and lets the fabric kind of gather in against the elastic. The elastic should stop about a 1/2 inch before the edge of the other end of the cap. Once you've completed that first zigzag stitch, you're going to take the elastic and fold it over, and then you're going to do a smaller zigzag stitch on top of it to finish off the edge. My second zigzag stitch is about, again, a 3 length, 4 width. As you sew the second zigzag stitch, you're pulling the elastic so the fabric will lay flat. We use the zigzag stitch and elastic here, so the cap will have a little bit of give in the back. Now to go ahead and make my ties. I took a strip of fabric that was about 2 inches wide and about 24 inches long. This is probably a little longer than you need, but I always like to make extra for ties because I hate if they're too short. I fold the fabric in a 1/2 inch at each side and then fold it in half and straight stitch it down the right side of the tie. Once I'm all done stitching, I give it a nice press under the iron. Once your ties are completed, we're going to go back to the cap and we're going to finish off the outside edge. You could finish this edge in one of 2 ways. One way would be to apply a bias strip to the outside edge, and the bias strip would continue off the back of the cap to become the tie. What I'm going to do instead is I'm going to do a small rolled hem along the outside edge. You can see here, I'm going to fold it down about a 1/4 of an inch and then another 1/4 of an inch on top of that. And when I go to sew this rolled hem, I'm going to take those ties, I'm going to tuck it up underneath that edge just to give the cap a little bit of a cleaner look. See here, I'm taking that tie, I'm placing it along the elastic edge, having it trail outwards, and then folding that piece of fabric on top of it. You can place a pin there to make sure it stays when you go to sew it. And the other tie will go on the other side of the cap. I'm going to start sewing with the tie facing out towards the right and the cap facing out towards the left. I'm doing this to reinforce that tie so we make sure it doesn't come off when the person goes to tie the cap on their head. I'm going to go ahead and give a little zigzag stitch just over where the tie attaches to the cap. And then once that's done, I'm sinking my needle and lifting my presser foot and rotating the cap 90 degrees. I also swapped the machine from a zigzag stitch to a straight stitch, and I'm going to go ahead and sew my rolled hem all the way around the edge of the cap. When sewing a neat rolled hem, we want to make sure that the stitching is as close to the left side or the fold of the rolled hem as possible. This will make the cap look extra professional. As I'm about to finish up that rolled hem and come towards the back of the cap, don't forget that we need to put in the second tie. You're going to repeat the same steps we did before, which was tucking the tie up underneath that rolled hem, stitching across it, and then sinking our needle, rotating, switching to a zigzag stitch, and then zigzagging across the tie to give it a little bit of extra strength. And once you're all done with this step, I want you to clip any stray threads, take it over to the iron, and give it one final press. And now your simple fitted scrub cap is complete. As another tutorial comes to an end, I just want to remind you that these pattern pieces are made for about the average head size and may need to be adjusted depending on who you're making your scrub cap for. Thanks again for stopping by Meghan Grace DIY. Before you go, if you have any questions, please feel free to leave them in the comment section below. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Happy sewing!